Please be seated. When we got the report from Amnesty International this week, the easy part was the outrage. What it says about Israel, apartheid, racist, evil, war crimes, it's easy to get outraged at that. The harder question is, what do you do about it? Beyond feeling the outrage that Hamas's thousands of missiles did not even get mentioned, beyond feeling the outrage that the fact that Israel got out of Gaza was not even mentioned, beyond feeling the outrage of all the thousands of Jews who have been murdered by terrorists that did not even get mentioned. Once you're done with the outrage, what do you do? So what we did was we called Rob Leikind, who is the regional director of AJC, and we would love his wisdom to put this latest attack on the Jewish people and the Jewish state in a context, and to advise us about what we can do that would be helpful to defend our beloved Eretz Yisrael. Rob, thank you so much for being here.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Gardenswartz. Whenever I find myself talking about big, scary issues, I have a story that comes to mind. And it's probably one that you've all heard. Two old Jewish men go to the park on a beautiful spring day to read the newspaper. After a while, one of them turns to his friend and takes a peek to see what he's reading, and he's outraged because he sees that his friend is reading a newspaper from Al-Manar, the publication of Hezbollah. And he's outraged. How can you read that filth, that garbage? And the friend turns back and says, you know, I saw what you're reading. You're reading the Jewish news. And the Jewish news is telling you that people hate you. They're going to attack you. They're spreading rumors about you that are put you in danger. I read my paper, and what do I discover? We're in charge. We run the world. Everybody's jealous of us. How do you feel? I'm feeling pretty good. The reason I think about this story is because in moments like these, we have to grasp for perspective. We, in fact, in the long story of Jewish community, live in a privileged community. We are secure in so many respects. We are comfortable in so many respects, and yet, look at the past week. And one finds from the past 2 weeks, a Jewish hostage-taking in Texas, a campaign going on to persuade people that Jews are responsible for the COVID pandemic, a new survey, actually by AJC, that came out of general French public and French Jews, that shows that anti-Semitism is spiraling to a degree unanticipated even now in France. And then we get the report that Rabbi Gardenswartz just cited from Amnesty International, accusing Israel of practicing apartheid. This report is fresh off the presses. It came out on Wednesday in a press conference in Jerusalem. It's several hundred pages long. I've had a chance to read its executive summary and some parts of it, read briefing papers from AJC and analysis from many different places at this point. The full content and the weight of it is going to need a lot of analysis. But at this point, I feel comfortable in making 3 observations. The first is, these charges are very serious and will fuel anti-Israel activism and push it more and more into the mainstream. The Amnesty report makes a range of allegations that in their entirety seek to demonstrate that Israel practices apartheid through which it dominates, controls, and oppresses Palestinians. To underscore the severity of the allegations, throughout the report, Amnesty describes Israeli practices with words like cruel, brutal, ruthless, and so on. The report makes many allegations to substantiate the charge of apartheid. Let me just summarize 3 of these. First, the report argues that from its birth, Israel was dedicated to maintaining a demographic majority and adopted policies to ensure that that's the case. The War of Independence was not a desperate struggle for survival. It was part of a comprehensive land grab, which resulted in the forcible expulsion of Arabs. Israel then perpetuated this program of demographic domination by preventing the return of refugees. It then expanded the policy by expropriating land from Arab inhabitants. In addition, Amnesty contends that Israel developed an intricate system of laws and regulations to control and oppress Arabs within Israel and outside the Green Line as well. These laws and policies have blunted economic development for Arab communities, deprived Israeli Arabs of resources needed to develop their communities, disrupted family reunification, interrupted travel and movement. It also zeroes in on the idea that Israel is both a Jewish and a democratic state and argues that the way Israel has organized itself makes the democratic part not real, particularly for non-Jews. There's so much more to be said about what's in this document, but for the moment, let's start by acknowledging that some of the accusations, that while many of the accusations are detached from any reasonable assessment of history and life in Israel, some of the accusations are based on real information. For example, Israel has had policies that sometimes have favored Jews. Israel does have security policies that impede Palestinian life, particularly in the occupied territories, and honest people do disagree over whether some of these policies have been warranted. And Israel's settlement policies have been deeply concerning to people in Israel and friends in America, let alone its enemies. While Israel has worked to address some of these issues, it's fair for Amnesty to call attention to them as it would to any other country in the world. But that is not what happened here. Amnesty abandoned standards of fairness and reason to engage in a full-throttle attack on par with the notorious Zionism of racism accusation that the Soviet Union brought to fruition in the 1970s. There is no doubt that this report will be seized upon by enemies of Israel to expand campaigns like BDS. And this brings me to my second observation. The Amnesty report is an unfettered attack on the moral foundation of the world's only Jewish state. The Wall Street Journal got it right when it said that the report treats Israel's founding as the original sin from which all other offenses flow. According to the report, Israel was born an apartheid state. To prove the point, it appears that the authors of the report scoured 74 years of Israeli history and plucked out the most grievous claims it could and then compressed them into a narrative that reframes Israel's reality. But to do this, it seems that they also sanitized their claims by removing them from historical, political, and legal context and information that might complicate the Amnesty report's conclusions. You won't learn from the Amnesty report that the War of Independence was at many moments a desperate struggle for survival, and that detailed research has confirmed that there was no plan to expel Palestinians. You won't learn that after the 1948 war, Arab leaders called for maintaining the refugee populations as part of a larger effort to reverse their defeat and annihilate Israel. You won't learn that Israel is a democracy, imperfect like every other, but with strong institutions that protect the right of its citizens, so that in this so-called apartheid state, an Israeli Arab Supreme Court justice sentenced a former prime minister to prison. An Arab party today is the linchpin of the current government. And anti-Zionist Israeli Arabs have been members of the Knesset. You also won't learn that many Palestinians disagree with the report's conclusions about Israeli democracy. For example, 68% of Palestinians expressed admiration for Israeli democracy in a recent poll. And according to a 2020 poll of Arab Israelis, they overwhelmingly prefer to be called Israeli than Palestinian Arabs. You will learn about the restrictions on movements of West Bank Palestinians, but you won't learn that these, including the barrier wall, were the direct result of terrorist attacks that cost thousands upon thousands of Israeli casualties and deaths. You also won't learn that the circumstances governing Arab citizens living in Israel and others living in the West Bank and Gaza are very different, with Israeli Arabs enjoying the rights and privileges of a democratic state, unlike those in the occupied territories who remain under occupation because multiple opportunities to create a Palestinian state at peace with Israel have been spurned. You won't learn that Hamas is committed to Israel's destruction and that it places a higher value on that than on the establishment of a Palestinian state. You won't learn that every conflict between Hamas and Israel was precipitated by thousands of missiles that placed millions of Israelis in shelters for weeks on end. And you won't learn that on multiple occasions, Israel made huge concessions to try to establish a Palestinian state next to it, living in peace. But that all resolutions were rejected by Palestinian interlocutors that would leave Israel, a Jewish state, intact. The list goes on and on and on, and the bigger it gets, the more it seems that this portrait of Israel and its democracy presented by Amnesty is at odds with a much more complex reality. And this gets me to my third observation. This report by Amnesty International is not happening in a vacuum. The failure to provide the necessary context for many of the claims that are being asserted gives the appearance that Amnesty's report was built around a series of political conclusions rather than an honest effort to study a complex series of problems. This impression was strengthened by an interview by the Times of Israel's Lazar Berman that took place with the Secretary General of Amnesty and its director of its Middle East, North Africa research desk, immediately after the press conference on Wednesday in Jerusalem announcing the report. Berman wanted to know why, of 193 nations of the world, did Amnesty select Myanmar and Israel to accuse it of being an apartheid state? Why not Turkey? It's been persecuting the Kurds, ethnically cleansing that region for years. Why not China? 2 million people now in ethnic concentration camps. Why not Syria and Iraq, where Sunnis and Christians have been systematically ethnically cleansed from that region and are refugees now all over the world? Why not countries like Iran, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, India, or many other countries, including, frankly, the United States, where persecution of minority populations is well documented? Many, if not most of the countries I mentioned, face far greater challenges than the worst that can be said about Israel. The best that they could offer is that they have been guided by where the debate is. One needs to stop for a second and pause and think about this. After 4 years of effort by one of the world's most prominent human rights organizations, this is all they could say about why they chose Israel? This statement was a fig leaf that covered very little. There's a global obsession today with portraying Israel as the exemplar of all that is wrong with the modern nation state. Each year at the UN, there are more resolutions condemning Israel than all the nations of the world. Academics and students at universities across this country and around the world are organizing to seek justice for Palestinians, even though many of them couldn't find Israel or Palestine on a map. And for many, Israel has become the focal point of a modern quest for justice. And the question that demands an answer is, why Israel from among all the nations of the world? David Nierenberg, the new director of the Center for Advanced Studies at Princeton University, has an answer. In his highly regarded book, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, he traces the inclination to associate Jews with moral corruption and view them as a danger to society to its beginnings in the debates and teachings of the early fathers of the Christian church. And then he documents how this idea has traveled through the centuries. It continues to not only influence attitudes about Jews, but shape the moral imagination of people across the West and much of the Muslim world. Jews today are assigned blame for capitalism and for communism. We are the authors of the nation's immigration problems, we are behind the COVID pandemic, and we shoot lasers from space to start forest fires in California. All these ideas are conspiracy theories that reflect a Western obsession with Jews and Jewishness that we often like to describe as anti-Semitism. And based upon what I've seen and heard, it's not hard to see that this report, at least in part, as one more conspiracy theory that places Jews at the center of the moral imagination of people across the West. This is what makes Amnesty's report so dangerous. It is a confirmation of what many are already inclined to believe about Jews, only this time we were being assigned one of the most despised and immoral practices known to modern man, apartheid. I think it was Barry Weiss who said that since the end of World War II, Jews have been on vacation from history. But that vacation, she maintained, is over. This report appears to confirm that. But we need to think about it not as an isolated matter, but as part of a larger challenge facing the Jewish community today. This is where we need to pause and reach for perspective. There's no doubt that what is happening is alarming. It's also true, however, that we're not alone. The good news is we are a well-established diaspora community, frankly, probably the most well-established and influential established community in Jewish history, diaspora community in Jewish history. We need to take action. We can't ignore it, but we also have to recognize that we've been endowed with opportunities that very few previous Jewish communities have had. In the short term, I can tell you, it's been 2 days, 72 hours now, since the report was released. AJC has been engaged with leaders in capitals across Europe and around the world. We're reaching out to members of Congress. We've issued videos, talking points, and much more will be coming. And I have to say that I'm sure that our efforts have been duplicated by other organizations around the world. But this isn't enough. We have to understand how grave this attack is and understand it, dissect it, and explore it. I will tell you in the last 2 days, I've had conversations with people, including members of foundations who are a foundation that's interested in possibly funding a deep dive, pulling together academic resources and scholarship to deconstruct what has been done here so that the lie that has been put out here can be addressed. But the problem here is not simply about Amnesty or proving that the claims that are being made in this report that's circulating around the world at this moment are untrue. The problem is that anti-Semitism is taking form in conspiracy theories, and many people don't understand what anti-Semitism is. AJC's 2021 survey of opinion in the United States shows that 1/3 of Americans have no idea what anti-Semitism is. Many of them have never heard of it before, the word before. Of the people who understand anti-Semitism, they understand it in its bluntest forms. There's a hijacking. Even there wasn't necessarily a hostage taking. Even there, the head of the FBI wasn't clear that this was an anti-Semitic attack. That tells us something about the knowledge people have about anti-Semitism and their ability to recognize it. That is a crucial problem that we face today. And it's also a problem we can do something about. There's been a discussion here, and it's happening in synagogues around the world, about something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. Desperately needs another name. This definition, however, has become an extraordinarily powerful tool that's been adopted by 33 countries. This presidential administration and the previous 2 presidential administrations. The Secretary General of the UN, 51 of 53 members of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, and the list goes on and on. 4 governors in New England. But what we need is the Jewish community to get behind this definition. That's what we need more than anything else, because when we walk to the mayor's office and say we need this, they need to know that their Jewish community cares about this definition, because what this definition does is it explains anti-Semitism in very simple terms, and then it provides us, when I say us, I mean everyone sitting in this room and people who aren't in this room today, with the opportunity to take this definition and walk into a police department and say, I want you to understand what we're concerned about. And I want you to help us deal with issues of anti-Semitism come in. Take that to a junior high school principal. Take it to the DEI director where you work. This is an opportunity for us to not only begin to educate about anti-Semitism on a local level, but then identify instances of anti-Semitism when they have. Part of when they happen, so that people can identify it and we can advocate and have a language to deal with it. To frame this in the simplest terms, many years ago, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart was asked, how do we define pornography? It was in part of a discussion of a case. And he said, you know it when you see it. Right now, that's the definition we're using of anti-Semitism. It's insufficient. And we cannot take care of our advocacy until we change that. So what do we do about this? We have a long road ahead of us with this report now being out. We will need to educate ourselves about it. We will need to do a lot more research than has been possible in the last 2 days. We're going to do it. Much of it is already happening. But the Jewish community has to recognize this as a symptom of a larger phenomenon. The opportunity for us today is to take charge of it, address the crisis, address the problem, and we have the power to do that. Thank you very much. Shabbat shalom.
Hey, Rob, thank you for a really superb talk. I have some questions for you. Great talk. First question is, on page 1 of the report, black, bold, all-cap letters is apartheid, and that's the leitmotif of the whole report, apartheid, apartheid, apartheid. Would you say that part of our response is to say it's not apartheid for the following reasons, or does saying not apartheid, just increase the word apartheid in Israel's word cloud? That's part 1. And part 2, like, do we have high school kids who are confused. We have college kids who are confused. Do we actually teach them that Israel is not apartheid and here's why? Or again, are we already losing once we put together that lesson plan?
That's a great question, Rabbi. I don't have the answer. I think we can't ignore the fact that the accusation is being made. But I think dwelling on the term is not going to help us either. It's out there. The problem is that these kinds of words become viral. And we can't, whether we talk about it or not, it's going to be out there now. It's going to be out there among college students. Our Jewish students are going to have to deal with the consequences of it. What we need to do is to begin to, part of the advantage that you get this, the case against Israel is being laid out in its blankest form. It's clear now, all the elements of it. It is possible, because I think they went to extreme lengths to make their case, to begin to undermine it, but it's going to be a long road, because it isn't just this report. It's about a narrative about Jews and Judaism that already has a lot of traction in our time.
Well, then, one more question.
Sure.
You state so, I think, exactly correctly that this report is an expression of and a symptom of deep Jew hatred. Anti-Semitism is the birthing ground of this report. And I guess my question is, what do you do at the deeper level about that? Let's say every synagogue in the world passes the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Then, once that's done, now what do we do about the underlying anti-Semitism from which this comes?
Part of the process, I think what the IHRA does, is it gives us a tool that we don't have right now. It allows us to walk in and say, it will give you examples of what could be anti-Semitic. So, for example, holding Israel to a standard that you're not holding other countries to, in the IHRA's language, could be anti-Semitic. Instantly, you have a conversation here. Pressed with the question, the number two person, the person most directly responsible for this report at Amnesty International, had no answer, no credible answer for why they focused on Israel. Singling out Israel instantly, if the IHRA were the norm, the use of the IHRA, would instantly raise a question about whether this was a piece of anti-Semitism. In other words, it changes the discussion. If people are using this working definition, then instantly this becomes a legitimate part of the discussion. Why did you focus on Israel? Why didn't you focus on the condition of the Dalits in India? Why not the Tamils there? And that becomes a legitimate point of discussion. At this moment, it's not.
Okay, last question, and then we'll get to Musaf. You're looking at ordinary folks who are members of a conservative synagogue. What can they do? When Shabbos is over, what can they do to express support of Israel in the wake of this attack?
I think that in the most immediate sense, people have to express their outrage. And I think that is it, the outrage about this report. I encourage you to learn more about it. You can go to the AJC website. Frankly, I think you could go to just about any major Jewish advocacy organization's website, and you will find a raft of information. Beyond that, though, we as a community have to engage the issue of anti-Semitism. It can't simply be the province of people like me, of organizations like mine, the ADL and others. This is something that requires local advocacy, and I do think that it starts with education. I think a synagogue like this has an extraordinary role to play in advancing that kind of education. We need to help people recognize what we recognize. We need to help people see what we see. We need to give a language for what we mean when we say anti-Semitism, so that we can be effective advocates. The fact that Israel is being singled out here in an extraordinary way, and that extraordinary lengths have been gone to isolate Israel, brings us to a place where we have to be able to identify that with authority as a potential instance of anti-Semitism. We can do that if we educate. It starts locally.
Rob, thank you. What I'm taking away from this is your quoting of Barry Weiss that our vacation from history is over. It's Monday morning. We need to get to work. And that's at multiple levels, including spiritual strength that we get together and from God. So let's rise for Chatzi Kaddish and Musaf, page 184.